Dear colleagues, thank you for taking our invitation. As you know, today the board of the Central Bank of Armenia reduced the refinancing rate by 0.25 pp to 10.25. We will request Mr. Nurbekyan, Deputy Governor of Central Bank, to make the presentation, and then you'll ask the questions. Last week you received the capital threshold definition justification, and if you have questions, please feel free to ask. Good afternoon. August the 1st, 2023, the board of the Central Bank decided to reduce the refinancing rate by 0.25 pp to 10.25. In June 2023, the 12-month inflation continued to decrease at a rapid pace, reaching minus 0.5%. The 12-month core inflation also declined significantly, amounting to 1.5%. In the second quarter of 2023, the rate of economic growth in the world and main partner countries of Armenia remains low, and the 12-month inflation continues to decrease. However, in all partner countries, ticket price inflation remains high amid sustained inflationary pressures coming from the labor market. Consequently, the Central Bank of partner countries will carry on conducting inflationary monetary policy influence to tight financial conditions. Prices in international commodity markets are falling further. As a result, the inflationary effects on the Armenian economy from the external sector continue to weaken. In the second quarter of 2023, again driven by strong growth reported by the construction and services sector, sustained high external demand and increased income in the domestic economy amid a large influx of capital, labor, tourism contributed to expanding demand. The inflation environment in Armenia continues to mitigate rapidly as a result of the notably weakened inflationary impact from the external sector, the implemented monetary policy, and the appreciation of the dram. However, price inflation of services and some goods is being adjusted, some slow, in the light of high demand and inflation expectations. So the board of the Central Bank of Armenia finds it appropriate to reduce the policy rate. The board will be continuing consistent in taking action to handle demand and stabilize inflation expectation. As outlined in the monetary policy scenario, the 12-month inflation will remain below the target in the near term. Then it will gradually increase and stabilize around the 4% target in the medium term. The board of the Central Bank estimates that the risk to inflation deviating from the projected path are mostly balanced in the event this risk materialize in any direction. The board stands ready to respond accordingly in fulfillment of the price stability objectives. ARCA agency, Mr. Nurbekyan, the question. Fitch recently forecasted that in 2023-2024 the dram is going to be appreciated moderately, even to higher rate than before the war in Ukraine. I would recall in February of 2022 the exchange rate was 478. What are the prerequisites for such a development, if any, and what would be the implications of this? And the other question, the Unistream related situation, there are contradictory news coming up. It sounds like the entire system is not operating, and the Russian media say that 8 banks in Armenia suspended this system. What's the situation in reality? Is there a possibility for more restrictions to be set in the context of the anti-Russian sanctions? Fitch rating has been raised last week, which is quite positive. It underlined that that our economic growth and sustainable fiscal environment allowed to raise the rating. Firstly, when we talk about the exchange rate, let's recall today's setting. Today, we don't see these prerequisites. We see the currency market, the appreciation trends are dominating, that's fact, and there is nothing new in terms of appreciation, and the flows were sustained, but it's still high in human capital. Is there a possibility for scenarios to have some depreciation? Yes, and this is bilateral. There could be more appreciation, there could be more depreciation. That's why the central bank talks about exchange rate not as an implication, but as a reason. Appreciation and depreciation depends upon a lot of things, and if the flows continue to be fluxing in more accelerated, then there won't be appreciation. If we see some other developments, then we'll see some scenarios for appreciation then. In any case, Fitch in its currency FX scenario set the moderate appreciation in the market in Armenia. And I would like to link this to the productivity rate. The implication is the appreciation of the currency rate due to influx of migrants, and whether it's going to be long-term, depending upon the long-term development of productivity. We are going to face the same productivity rate growth, then the depreciation will be local. If it's a shorter term, then there will be pressures. Fitch reflected that the high economic growth we're having, the significant part is not short-term. That's why our FX in their scenario is not following the previous levels, but rather it follows to some depreciation scenario. Then the central bank forecasts and our previous communications, we don't think that the 12.6% is completely potential growth. That will be very difficult to make it. We were quite modest in our assessment, but we have been always focusing, and in one of our monetary policy forecasts, we see the appreciation as a result of influx of labor. The potential growth was raised by us. The main message from us is that if we talk about FX, then it's important to understand what kind of scenarios we're talking about under this FX. And the risks are bilateral. The currency could be both depreciated and appreciated depending upon the geopolitical risk, which is number one, uncertainty everywhere, and this is going to be the important driver. I try to bring some examples if we have a look from our internal economy, influencing different scenarios for FX. As to the unit stream, we talk about the monetary policy today. It's an important question to respond to. There are banks in the Republic of Armenia, not in small quantities, which operate with unit stream system in ruble and Armenian dram, not in FX. Not only banks, but also financial organizations. So we can get these services because Unistream was prevailing system for the citizens to make remittances from Russia to Armenia. So we didn't see this uncertainty was big in the beginning, but so far we can see some stability. In terms of the future, other restrictions, whether they're possible or not, naturally, over the 1.5 years, you saw different packages And the brief response is that anything is possible, and for that we're trying to design our systems for our citizens to continue receiving their services. And we succeeded, I think, because our citizens basically get their payments, and in terms of using financial services, they didn't face any disruptions. In any case, I wanted to say also that it's important to understand that the financial system is very cautious, and it looks at the issues in longer term for us to be sure that the citizens won't face any problems in the meantime, and the risks are quite assessed in details, and including the Unistream, in case of Unistream. I'm sorry, how many banks can you verify? How many banks work with the Unistream? I'm not sure about the exact number. If I'm not mistaken, there should be 6, but I can't be sure about the number. Thank you. One clarification related to previous question. The banks and also other market participants, what kind of institutions are those? And out of the main questions, though in June the inflation was in negative domain, -0.5, but as in the previous month, the unpredicted inflation remains to be higher than normal. It's -0.5%, but restaurants and hotels, it's 6.6, entertainment 5.4%. Does this mean that the high inflation expectations are still significant and they still require addressed approaches? Thank you. Related to previous question, I meant the payment services providers like Telcel, etc. As to the specifically inflation, you're right that the board, when making its decision, looks at one consumer price index only, but to many other indices. And the governor last time mentioned that under provision 4 is clearly saying that indeed in the Republic of Armenia, and it should be said that it's a global phenomenon, that we see from one side that on the one hand that the inflation is going down, but on the other side, as you mentioned, these services, mainly the groups of goods and the services which are mainly related to the demand, they're good indicators of demand, they're still at the high rates, and this is on the scale side, it's set properly. The board considered this risk much smaller than, and because of that we continue to reduce the rate. But naturally, what is the risk today? That the victory, so-called, to announce it as soon as possible, because the commodity and foodstuff market goes down, but the overheating should be maintained, and the indices of the overheating is rising, wages is still high. So these are the two risks we're taking into consideration at the board. And once again, risk to the previous period was considered much smaller, and which is the reason for reducing the rate. Under the issues of the facilities show that the average wages in IT sector was much above the average in the rest of the sectors, and this demonstrates the solvency of migrants. And related to this, whether you had the possibility to follow the overall relocant structure, which can be changed over time, whether their composition of those who are in Armenia prevail IT, financial sector, and other highly paid sector employees, or there is a significant endowment of other sector representatives, employees, whose solvency is not that high, and the phenomenon of the migrants is not that high anymore. Thank you. It's important. For what? Because it's related to the potential I've mentioned in the previous response. Look, the number you're talking about is the registered, not resident employees, which is as of January the 1st, 2022, is about 19,000. So we have about 2.5% of growth, a bit more. This is the number of the registered employees. Naturally, we have significantly bigger influx, and the majority of them are not registered employees. Naturally, these employees who are registered, their wages, as you mentioned, is more than 4 times higher than the average wages, which speaks of the fact that they're highly qualified, mostly IT specialists. For that, I would say that in the 2 months recently, we can see the growth. We don't see the decrease. That's the reason for revising the rate. When we face bigger influx, the number of people who came to Armenia stayed, the numbers, they're more than 15 or 16,000. We talk about 70,000 or 80,000 people. Naturally, statistically, we have a significant problem because we have a growth of migrants from Russia, part of whom are not registered, like freelancers. You see that there are many such visitors. But at the same time, the touristic flows at the same time went up significantly. And in real time, it was very difficult to segregate these flows. That would be very difficult to answer your question in real time. But yes, during the board discussion, we considered these options too. For example, it's possible that many options are in place, and the influx for migrants and family members. The options are diverse, and unfortunately the real statistics is not popping up. But what we can say is still the highly qualified specialists, both the non-resident new private entrepreneurs established by the migrants, we don't see any slowdown significantly, and the flows are being maintained basically. One more question about overheating. The average wages data of the Armstat by sectors of occupation as of April witnessed that the entertainment and rest sector, the growth is still higher. It's 50% in the entertainment. The manufacturing and agriculture is between 10 to 20%. The agriculture is lower, of course. Does it mean that the overheating can still be maintained for some time? Thank you. Yes, we talked about the inflation, and this is reflected in the labor market. In the private market, we have 20% annual growth, which is a significant number. If we look at the opened number, the sectoral wages growth, it's again quite wide. Of course, we have sectors which are quite different, and the growth are much bigger than in the other sectors, and it's reflecting our economic activity structure. But it sounds like there is still quite broad growth wages. It's directly linked to the risk defined initially. If we have high, in reality, inflation in some places which are demand indicators, but the consumer index will go down, and we will set the victory soon. Today, this risk was considered low by the board. The data we received recently are consistent with our expectation, and the inflation slowdown is in line with our expectations. And in terms of commenting our step, I wanted to draw your attention to the following. Look, from our decrease, from our step, quite shortly before that, our main partner countries' central banks raised the rate. The U.S. Federal Reserve, which is the central bank in the U.S., raised by 0.25 pp. The same about European. The Russian central bank raised by 1 pp. Under this situation, when everyone is raising and we're reducing the rate, it's a message to you that in reality the comparative rate compared to the international financial markets is not going down by 0.25 but by 0.5 pp. I think it's an important message that despite the fact that the fight against inflation is going on, the central bank of Armenia, since we reacted to the inflation sooner, we can allow ourselves to reduce this rate under the rates going up in the rest of the world. It's a very important message, and the board signified this a lot. I'm saying this in the context of wages. Yes, the risks are maintained. We do not want to hurry up, but at the same time we can say that the rate of the risk quite decreased compared to the previous meeting. Ministry of Finance issued recently the performance sheet of the first 2 quarters, and the budget was completely performed, and this rate and these components. Have you done any adjustments based on the real situation? Thank you. In overall, well, we make our judgments in the capital expenditure for all the monetary policy decisions, but for the capital expenditure there is a couple of things. Of course, the government can provide more details on this, but in any case we're not still we don't still hurry to make changes, because there are many instances when the part is done in the first half of the year, and there are some changes throughout the year, so we're still not reflecting on this, but so far we don't see any significant need to reflect, because historically it happens a lot that the capital expenditure in the first or the second half of the year are significantly changed. Related to demand, the first quarter there was a situation when the consumer loans growth on average amount was higher than the overall loans setting. Whether it's the case now again, but this can create additional risk. My colleagues would state the number more accurately, of course. So far, from crediting market, we cannot see any significant risks from this market. There is growth in demand from our businesses for crediting, but we can't see still that the consumer crediting market is going to be under tremendous pressure. It's the segment of the mortgage crediting because of the flux of construction. But my colleague would present more. Yes, for the consumer loaning, it's a bit ahead of the overall crediting figures, but we don't see this risk because they're in a longer term, the growth rates are much modest figures, and they're consistent with the overall crediting portfolio figures. In the previous years, as you recall, the consumer loans was modestly growing, and actually this year, under this high economic activity, there is some activities under consumer loans, not only but for all lines of crediting. There is some growth of activity in the approaches of the banks. Is there any change, or they still maintain this cautious approach? Their appetite, it sounded like there was such a situation that 9% high income, their appetite was not that high for the overall crediting as before, and they did create quite favorable conditions for crediting. Can we stay like this, or it's the case now? Still, I would say that today's situation for the crediting, today's behavior of the banks, I would call it as reasonable. It's not surplus or restraint. We can assess that the crediting rate growth is is the natural, normal growth rate which is considered in the banking system in overall. I would like to say one thing. Look, when we talked about crediting, in particular for last year, and some growth rates, naturally we're saying this in the context, but given the growth of deposits, the huge one, including from non-residents, naturally the crediting couldn't have been the same, and as my colleague mentioned, it's reasonable behavior. So we don't see the situation for these flows, which under different scenarios to have different future to convert into long-term funds naturally, and at the same time our economy won't be able to absorb that much this kind of volume. So it's reasonable. After all, one more thing to mention, as in the beginning it was mentioned, last week we made a decision on counter-cyclic buffer, and we maintained it at the same rate. That's the mandatory capital buffer, which is requested from the banks to be maintained. We raised this over 8 to 9 months by 0.1%. It's not because of the overheating we saw, but under this situation we consider this the right behavior to put the capital in our banking system for any unexpected shocks to be overcome by our banking system without any difficulty, and not to distort the mediation in the banks. If you look at the overall context, our counter-cyclic buffer decision, we think, as Mr. Saksan mentioned, the banking system is properly serving the economy, and it's ready for different scenarios, which is the logic of our counter-cyclic buffer decision. If there is some demand from business sector for some financial resources, is it the fact that they somehow deplete the volume of their term deposits over 1 year? The legal person's term deposits went up. And overall, I think that the resident legal entities deposits are still at high level. But in order to refer to specific numbers, the residents, the legal entities, if you look at the term deposits trends, then in overall, in the recent 1 year, there's a 38% of growth. That's over 1 year. The legal entities and deposits. If you look at the recent 6 months, then we have over this 6 months, it's about 1.6% reduction. There's still some reduction, but this is not comparable to the previous 12-month growth completely. What's the explanation for this if we have the demand for finance, but still, nevertheless, they don't want to put into circulation the funds accrued at deposits? We don't have the clear answer to this question so far, and we talked along at the board. There are different options, not mandatorily that this demand and the surplus is in the same sectors. There are sectors which are growing rapidly, the others otherwise, but for that we don't have final response. Since there was a growth last year for new projects, there is time needed. And apart from the construction sector, we see that the projects pop up quite fastly. This could be different in different other sectors. So we will make more surveys to understand better in the industrial sector the crediting demand for us to be able to clearly answer your question. Then, related to external markets, whether you assessed this the withdrawal of Russia from the wheat deal, any potential impacts on the wheat prices? It's a complicated issue. On the international prices of wheat, no question about potential inflation impact. But you know that our internal prices are not directly linked to the international prices because we import from Russia, and in that case we don't think that the inflation impact would correspond to the international prices. Based on our previous year experience, we've had quite low impact, but this time we don't see any significant impact on the prices this year too. We don't expect any. Would you like to add? By mentioning this, if we look at the actual reaction of the markets in terms of the international prices, but I should add to what Mr. Nurbekyan mentioning, there could be even deflation risk as well. The Russian Federation, under cancelling this deal, they can, by going out of the international markets in the internal economy and evolving markets, there could be some depreciation, deflation risk Mr. Nurbekyan mentioned. Previous year, in the beginning of the year, under this situation when there was quite significant inflation in the rest of the world, they were very poorly reflected in the internal market in Armenia, just because of the same reason. Thank you. Thank you.